Welcome into another D3 Classic.
Classy.
Welcome into another D3 Datacast. Hope you're coming off a restful week. It was a little bit quiet on the D3 hoops front, and it feels like we kind of skipped a week. Matt, this episode's theme is going to be all about skipping. No, we didn't pull a Luther crank and try to skip Christmas, but since it was a quiet week, we are going to skip the 4-point play. And we're going to talk about skipping the rest of the season. We're going to simulate the season 1,000 times, talk about maybe, at this point, what the D3 Datacast computer sees as the most likely outcomes heading into tournament play. Are you ready to skip along together, Matt?
Yeah, we don't want to wish the end of the season away. We're going to enjoy all the games, but we always like to think about what could happen. We live in this computer world. Computers like to simulate things. My computer's always trying to simulate things without me. And yeah, let's look ahead. We run simulations almost every day on d3datacast.com. So you can find those all season long. But Zach, kind of this is like a pause almost between the page turn between 2025 and 2026. Most teams are going to have conference play majority ahead. So let's look and see maybe what our simulations are telling us right now, and then allow people to maybe view them as we progress throughout the season on d3datacast.com in light of this episode, and see how things change as we get more results in January and February.
Before we dive too deep into it, it might be worth just taking a moment to talk about what these things at this point maybe mean, what they may not mean, because I think sometimes when we take this kind of view, it could be incorrectly assumed that we're trying to say that the computer knows what's going to happen. Go back to some of these 4-point plays that we've had. I know we're skipping it this week, but we like talking about, like celebrating some of the big computer upsets we see. And right, so sometimes it's not about trying to be right or say we know what's going to happen, but put some context around some things that and try to determine, hey, what's maybe most likely to happen. And then it's not about being defensive when it's wrong.
Yeah.
Even something that's like a 2% outcome means that sometimes it happens. It just doesn't happen as much, right? So we really like to celebrate those, what might be seen as like outlier occurrences, right? So let's talk about maybe kind of these simulations and the odds and that sort of thing, just to set a little bit of context around this to try to dissuade anyone who wants to approach this topic like we're trying to say we know what's
Yeah.
going to happen, or that what happens, in the games yet to be played, don't really matter.
Yeah. Yeah, so on the screen now is a view of what the website looks like from some of these simulations, and you can showing this is the top 20 in projected tournament odds, but you can scroll all the way down and see everyone's projections. But yeah, Zach, you're right. It's not showing what is one future truth in a simulation, right? We know what's going to happen, which branch we're going to be on. But what our computer does is we run team efficiency ratings. So that's team quality. So we say we know about or how good our computer thinks each team is. And then for each remaining game on the schedule, we can match the two teams up and get a projected win expectancy, right? So we think team A is going to win this game 70% of the time. And then that's the same for all their schedule. Then we simulate those games. So how do I simulate a game? If the win expectancy is 70%, then I throw a random number generator. If it's 70 or below, that team wins. If it's above 70, then that team loses. And we do this for every single game. Then we calculate the NPI. We have conference tournaments, so we simulate a conference tournament. So we seed teams by conference winning percentage, and then we seed a conference tournament, simulate that, get an automatic qualifier. We do that for every conference. Then we have the next 21 best NPIs. Those are our at-large bids, and those are teams that have qualified for the tournament. So we do that. The computer does that one time. It does it twice. It does it 3 times. On a typical daily run, I run 1,000. I'd love to do like 10,000, but I think 1,000 gives you a pretty good picture, gives you directional ranges of where teams stand. So we're simulating 1,000 future possibilities based on how good the computer thinks each team is. Now, in between each run, I inject some randomness in that team quality. So it's not just what their rating is on D3Datacast.com. I also throw a random number generator around that. So we think we know how good Randolph Macon is, but we're not exactly sure. So that number fluctuates run to run based on a random number generator that is larger at the beginning of the season and gets smaller by the end of the season when we're pretty sure what teams are. So we do that 1,000 times, and then we're looking at a range of outcomes for every team. So when we look at the odds, so if we say Trinity, Connecticut has 100% odds of making the tournament, that's not necessarily saying in real life they're guaranteed. If they lose all the rest of their games, they're not going to make the tournament. But what the 100% odds means is in the 1,000 simulations that we ran, based on NPI, based on how good we think Trinity, Connecticut is, what their real schedule is, what their NESCAC tournament could look like. If they have 100% tournament odds, that just means there were no simulations where they didn't make the tournament. 1,000 times out of 1,000. Maybe if we ran it 10,000 times, we might get one. Maybe if we ran it 100,000 times, we might get a larger handful of times where they didn't make the tournament. But the 100% odds or a 50-50 odds just means 500 times out of 1,000 or 1,000 times out of 1,000, this team inside of the simulations did or did not win their AQ or make the tournament or get a at-large bid or whatever the column is, right? So that's what we're talking about when we do simulations. You're right to say we don't, quote unquote, know what's going to happen. But also, like, let's contextualize that a little bit. If we had 10 teams with 90% odds of making the tournament, our computer is saying, we expect that one of these teams actually will not make the tournament at this point, right? So that's what it means. It means that team at 90% is not guaranteed. It means 9 times out of 10, they will make the tournament. And likely at this point, one team inside that bucket might not.
It's a great explanation and important to just highlight that 100% tourney odds doesn't mean that team could lose out the rest of the way and be in the tournament. What it would mean is that, if Trinity were to lose out the rest of the season, then they very much would not be the kind of team that the computer currently thinks them
Right.
to be. Right. So the accuracy, so to speak, again, it's not necessarily about being right, but trying to identify what looks like to be the most likely outcomes is dependent on how accurate the computer rating is in describing the strength of that team.
All right, Zach. So, like we said, check almost every day on the site. If you go to d3datacast.com, if you go to the NPI header, men's basketball projections, it'll get you to these types of views. There's kind of two. There's a bubble watch for just at-large bid consideration. Then there's the full list of teams, 410 or whatever teams that has their full odds. There's always a date and timestamp there, so you can see when it was posted. So usually every morning, my cadence is I update efficiency ratings, I update NPI, and then I set my simulations to run. And because I'm not good at coding, that takes an hour or two to complete. So usually by 9-10 o'clock in the morning, those are fresh and posted for the day. If it's a light day, I maybe won't always run it, and things won't change very much. But definitely, like, I'm trying to capture like Friday and Saturday results almost every time. So check that out every day. So when we're looking at simulations, let's go ahead, Zach. One thing to look at is who are the most likely automatic qualifiers from each conference. We have 43 conferences that get an automatic bid. 42 of those conferences determine their automatic bid by conference tournaments. And the UAA doesn't have a conference tournament. They're the only one that awards it to their regular season champion. So when I just described our simulations, part of what we do is try to mimic a conference tournament. So I seed each conference within the simulation and then run a tournament and then give the champion the pool A. So when we talk about on the screen here are the most likely automatic qualifiers from each conference, and that's just the team that showed up the most often. So from some conferences, that's a really high number for a particular team. I don't know who's the highest off the top of my head. I didn't record that, but let's just say like a team like Trinity, even though the NESCAC is strong, they do show up as winning the AQ a large percentage of the time. Same with Randolph Macon in the ODAC. They show up as winning that a large percentage of the time. So that might be 75, 80% of the time they show up to win that. Other conferences, I'm just going to pull out the NCAC. I think they were the lowest percentage. So their most likely champion for their AQ is DePaul right now but that was only 27% of the time did DePaul win the AQ in our simulations. It was almost three teams with about 25% odds, and then like another team with 15 and another team with 7. It was really low. So teams like DePaul, like John Carroll, Wabash, like they're all in the mix. Wittenberg, that tournament could go a bunch of different ways. Right now, the MIAA looks like Calvin is a big favorite, and then Hope and Trine somewhat below that. But so there's a big range here. There's also conferences like the SCIAC that are really interesting. It seems like Redlands and Claremont Mudd Scripps both have like a 40% chance of winning. They're two big names, so neither one is super high, but they're pretty even. Two big names, and then no one else has a lot of odds. So conferences can be shaped in very different ways as far as the strength at the top or the quality throughout, or how many teams could likely win it. So, but when I think about like tournament season simulations, tournament bracket projections, who could win the automatic qualification, you have to pick one team from each conference. And so when you look at Pool A odds, that's the AQs. Here's what our computer thinks right now as of late December, what it thinks each conference's most likely champion is.
And of course, once the automatic qualifiers are accounted for, then you start looking at that next group of teams, other teams to round out that tournament field. Those are the at-larges. Matt, you referenced on the page that we have set up at d3datacast.com, kind of the bubble watch view, right? So that's, I think, the other thing to start talking about here based on the 1,000 simulations and how often teams, should they need an at-large bid, get one.
Yeah, and I should say for podcast only people. So if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcast, you're not seeing the graphics right now that the YouTube folks are. Either check out the website or check out the YouTube video, and you can see we just listed the most likely AQs for all 43. So here's the at-large bid view. And this is also ripped from the website, so this is something you can see. We call it the bubble watch view. It's really interesting the last couple of weeks of the season, but even right now, it's pretty instructive. So this is each team's at-large chances should they not win the AQ. So I just mentioned Trinity, Connecticut, and Randolph-Macon win their AQs an awful lot of times, but not every time. Those are good conferences. Other teams can beat them in those tournaments. So just looking at the subset of times when they didn't win, then how often did they get an at-large bid into the tournament when they didn't win their conference tournament? So let's say Trinity, Connecticut won their AQ 900 times out of 1,000. Only looking at that 100 times when they didn't, how many times did they still get into the tournament as at-large? For them, it's still 100%. For Randolph-Macon, it's 100%. So from that perspective, we're saying they are locks and near locks. If they play largely how we think that they can play, that's probably taking some losses along the way. Obviously, if you're in an at-large position, you've taken at least one loss by definition. Then these teams are still in good shape. So don't take a bunch of losses, but they can take some losses given their schedule. And then it fills down from there. So again, this is only considering a bunch of these teams, all those teams basically, or a bunch of teams on the previous slide that are most likely automatic qualifiers could show up on this and have some amount of at-large chance. If you're if you're really in the bubble in or bubble out position in these columns, you really want to go into tournament weekend thinking that you probably need your AQ to win, to get in. Don't feel great being on the bubble at all in Division III because we know things can shift. Upsets happen around the country. You don't want to be in that last few spots out. So the safest way in Division III is always to win your automatic qualifier, always win your AQ. And if you're in the bubble out or probably out, you're going to want to win your AQ. But this view is looking at, should you have not won your conference tournament, your AQ, then how likely are you to be in the tournament anyway? Go look at this view.
And this will change a lot because as it's projecting out future games, every future game played, there's some chance that a team wins and some chance that a team loses until that game is played. So to the extent that a team picks up a win that was maybe unexpected, that's going to really help their, at-large odds should they need them. If there's an unexpected loss, that's going to really knock down the number here. So to some extent, every game played as it goes in the books is going to have an impact on on these numbers. It's just a matter of how much that result varies from what an expected win probability might have been.
Yeah.
And of course, looking at this list, like a Trinity, a Randolph Macon, you're going to see a lot of conference favorites on here.
Mhm.
So this isn't going to be just take the top 21 teams. There's going to be some and quite a few automatic qualifiers in here that end up getting filtered out. But you see a lot of teams in the mix, and that's largely due to the fact that there's just a lot of uncertainty, of course, by nature of games not being played yet. There's a wide range of outcomes here to consider, and right, this is just kind of how it all works out over the course of 1,000 simulations.
Yeah, and it's always interesting to me how it works out. Basically, if you take anyone with a 50% odds or greater, if you start looking at the conferences, you get 21 bids minus the expected AQs. So like UAA has a bunch of teams in here. One of these teams is going to win. Like by definition, the UAA is AQ because they don't have a conference tournament. So basically, one of those top teams is going to win us. That's kind of a quote unquote extra bid. NESCAC has a bunch of teams in here. WIAC has a few teams in here. So if you count like 21 plus the conferences whose champion is going to be pretty safe anyway, then you kind of get to the 50-50 point is, that's the cutoff line. So 21 plus those like multi-bid automatic conferences is kind of where it comes out. Okay, Zach, another way to think about at-large bids isn't the just when you need it, right? It's who's most likely to be in that position anyway. So now we're just considering all simulations, who received the at-large bids. So a team on this view, a team like Trinity, Connecticut, Randolph-Macon, not going to show up because they won their team's their conference's AQ very often, so they're not likely to need the AQ, so they don't show up in this. Again, and I think of this as like one of the ways to project who the at-large teams would be if you're making a mock bracket or something like that, or doing mock selections. You have to think who are the most likely champions, and now taking out those champions, which teams then are likely to be kind of on the table for at-large selection. So some interesting names here to me. Right at the top, the most likely at-large team in the whole country right now is Bates out of the NESCAC. And that's an interesting name to me because they are not, I think they have gotten some top 25 votes, but I don't think they've been in the top 25 at this point. They're not a team, I don't think they've played a particularly strong schedule, but they have a good record. They've played a good enough schedule that I think you called this out an episode or two ago, that their NPI, if you just look season to date at this point, late December, their NPI, for whatever that's worth, is pretty high at this point. So they're going into NESCAC play looking pretty strong with a good record. Our computer does think that they're a stronger team, maybe stronger than the Massey ratings thinks they are right now, or maybe even the Jacob Shower ratings. I haven't looked at that today. But they maybe could suffer a few losses in NESCAC play and still be at-large viable. So really interesting to me. That's not a name that has been kind of on the top of national rankings so far this year, but to show them at like 97% of all simulations, Bates ended up with an at-large bid is really, really interesting to me. I'm fascinated to see how that number specifically changes as the year goes on. Our efficiency ratings does call them out as the number 3 team in the country, which seems a little strong for me at this point, but they are 9-0. So even though they've played only kind of a middling schedule, they've done well against that schedule so far.
Yeah, and again, you mentioned where they stand in NPI. You can say what you want about their schedule, but and the how well or the limitations maybe of NPI in actually describing team strength.
Yeah.
But there are other teams on here that haven't played a great schedule, and NPI doesn't particularly like what they've done so far. But Bates is looking good, both in how the D3 Datacast computer views them and their current standing in NPI.
Yeah, so the rest of some of these teams that are high in the at-large bid percentage, Tufts, Wesleyan, Wash U, Amherst, another team like Bates who maybe hasn't played a strong schedule yet, has a good record. The computer thinks they're pretty good, but we'll have to see how they perform against stronger competition. UW Eau Claire, Emory, UW Stevens Point, UW Whitewater, Chicago. These are all power conference teams. And I think one of the things that this tells us is that they have a lot of opportunity. Well, for the most part, they have good records right now. So they already have put themselves in a good position. Let's just call it through non-conference play. I know that's not the dividing line for every single conference right here, but they've put themselves in good position here into, Christmas time, let's say going into the new year. And they have the type of conference schedule that allows them to continue to rack up good wins and have opportunities to do so. So if you can take advantage of many of those opportunities, then you are putting yourself in a strong position. Other teams from other conferences that don't have strength really, really, really have to take advantage of every single opportunity. Otherwise, they're just not going to be viable. Think of our team, Zach. Think of Calvin. They have a game against Mount Union coming up this week. That's their last non-conference game to get a really strong result. Then in conference, you have your Hopes and your Trines that have strong NPIs or should have strong NPIs, but there's a lot of 3-4 teams in the conference that would probably get dropped from their NPI calculation. It would be they once they get the 12.5 wins, they're wins that would otherwise hurt your NPI. So a team like Calvin doesn't go into conference play with that many opportunities to really, really build their NPI. So they will have a smaller margin for error, where teams like Wesleyan, teams like Wash U can take more losses because their wins in conference will be worth more than the average MIAA win would likely to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's nothing magic about these being power conference teams. It's just that these power conferences are power conferences because they've got a depth of teams that are going to be hitting conference play at, like an 8-2 or better record. So as the ones that jump out here, the NESCAC, UAA, and the WIAC in particular, like they've got a bunch of those teams that have won an awful lot of games. And then we talked about some of the top conferences in the efficiency ratings a few weeks ago, and I think number 4 at that time was the CCIW, and that's where maybe we're not seeing a CCIW show up a bunch on this list, is because they have a lot of really good teams that are tightly grouped together, but they don't have that depth of teams that have those 9-1, 8-2 types records. It's a lot of teams that have maybe already suffered 3 or 4 losses, right? So that's going to change that whole dynamic.
Yep.
And it's not going to be as beneficial to them to beat each other up like it might be for some of these other conferences, where beating each other up might help 4 or even 5 teams get in.
Yeah. And the other thing I'll say to that end, when we talk about conferences and multiple teams at large, if you look at the second column, maybe that's like teams 11 through 20 in the at-large percentages here. I just picked out Conn College and Colby, two more teams from the NESCAC. Throw in Bowdoin there, right? So 52%, 45%, 44%, or 44, 43%. Sometimes it by the end of the year, that doesn't mean that you're likely to get all 3 of those teams. Maybe one of those teams has lost at the expense of the other teams. So maybe that means Conn College and Colby end up in the tournament. Their odds trend toward, everyone's 100 or 0 by the end of the season, right? So maybe their odds trend up. And if Bowdoin takes 2 of those losses, maybe their odds trend down. So you're maybe unlikely to see all 3 of those teams. It's probably theoretically possible. But when you see multiple conferences like that, where you have 2 teams with like 50-50 odds, sometimes it means the one team gets in and the other team gets out. Like maybe that semifinal or quarterfinal game is like really big. It's going to get a team in and a team out. So sometimes with conferences where you have a bunch of teams muddling around the middle, 1 or 2 of them coalesce towards 100, 1 or 2 of them coalesce towards 0, and that's how you end up seeing it play out. All right, so that is at large bids. So another thing. Oh yeah, go ahead, Zach.
Let's talk about one more thing right here, because just kind of looking in aggregate, one of the things I think you lose that is certainly a dynamic we're watching in those conference tournament week is the bid thief situation, right? Those upsets that happen where one of those teams that we talked about before, who is the most likely to win their AQ, doesn't win their AQ, right? Most likely doesn't mean they will win it. It just means that they might be the favorite. And of course, every year, tournament time, we're talking about those upsets really shaping who's in and who's out. So that's one of the things that I know are accounted for in the simulations as you're looking at some of the odds, and you explained it in terms of thinking about it in the number of times out of 1,000. That's another thing that you show and you track.
Yeah.
Is in each of those particular runs within the 1,000 simulations, kind of what is the range of the bid thieves. Sometimes there's a lot of conference tournament upsets. Sometimes there's not a lot of conference tournament upsets, right? So let's just have a little discussion, because
Yeah.
I think that is maybe what gets missing when we kind of take more of an aggregate look at the simulations as a whole.
Yeah, that's a great call out. So I do track at the top of the projections page bid thieves. Some simulations there are no bid thieves. All the favorites basically win. There's as many as 9 or 10 bid thieves in many batches of simulations. On average, 3 or 4 ends up being kind of normal, 3, 4, 5, that range. But for example, Zach, we've been talking about Trinity, Connecticut in the NESCAC as a big national favorite. If they don't win the NESCAC tournament, but a team like Tufts does or Wesleyan does, that's unlikely to be a bid thief situation, because probably all 3 of those teams were going to get in anyway.
Right.
If UW Eau Claire wins the tournament or UW Whitewater wins the tournament, that might not matter, right? Those aren't bid thief situations. But if you get down to what's a really good example, depending on how things go, Claremont Mud Scripps might be, or maybe them and Redlands are both in a good situation. But let's say Pomona Pitzer ended up winning the SCIAC tournament. That would be a bid thief situation, because maybe the SCIAC was really in range to get 2 bids. Now they might get 3. So that's probably going to push a team off the bubble and get that league 3. So it's a bid thief is a team who would have otherwise finished outside of the Pool C top 21, the at-large bid top 21, but has now won their AQ when another team from that conference is inside that top 21. So we're getting an at-large bid from the conference, and the team that won the conference tournament was from outside that. That's a bid thief situation, which means kind of the quote-unquote top deserving teams by NPI were losing a spot because a conference upset happened that bounced the team in front of the favorite.
So we've talked about automatic qualifiers, we've talked about at-large selections, but of course, when it comes to the tournament and the bracket, it's not just about who gets in and who's left out, but where teams are seated. In particular, starting with the teams that receive those top 8 protected seeds, the number 1 through 8 in the final NPI standings. And this is kind of one of the fun things about NPI is we don't have to try to model or predict how a human committee might rank these teams or select these teams, right? It all comes down to that NPI formula calculation, which makes projecting it a little bit easier than having to kind of
Yeah.
account for create some sort of model expectation based on what we feel like we've seen or learned from past
Right.
committees and how it might play out.
Yeah, at the end of each simulation, the regular season is simmed, the conference tournaments are simmed, the bids are doled out, but everything is the NPI is calculated for that theoretical future state, right? So we know, okay, in simulation 25, here were the top 8 seeds. In simulation 98, here were the top 8 seeds. So we can also calculate what percentage of the time does each program end up in those spots. Top 8 is a big number because by definition, they will be bracketed such that they cannot meet until a national quarterfinal. So doesn't matter about geography, doesn't matter about flights in Division III. By definition, for the top 8 seeds, we will separate them from the bracket. So in practice, this means your number 1 seeds, if you think of like a Division I bracket, your 4 number 1 seeds and your 4 number 2 seeds will be put in those slots on those seed lines.
Opposite sides of the quadrants, right?
Opposite sides of the quadrants, yeah. So in every simulation this year or right now, Trinity, Connecticut is receiving a top 8 overall seed. I don't know if that's like maybe they're 8 in some spots. A lot of times they're 1, a lot of times they're 2. But in every situation, every simulation, Trinity, Connecticut got a top 8 seed. Randolph-Macon right there at 98%. Bates, the team we talked about already, 78% of the time with what the computer thinks about them right now, they are getting a top 8 protected seed. Mount Union, 52% of the time. Chicago, 50% of the time. Hood, 43% of the time. UW Eau Claire, 39, and Emory, 37. So those are our top 8 most likely top 8 protected seeds. But there's, of course, still a bunch of teams that have some chance to get into that range. UW Whitewater, Cortland, Catholic, you can see them on the screen here, that have some chance to play themselves into that spot, but aren't getting that the most frequent amount of times in the simulations.
All right, so taking that same approach go from the top 8 to the top 16, which are not guaranteed to be those opening
Yeah.
weekend hosts, but, typically, they're kind of in position to or considered, in position to, and, more often than not, they are gonna be, the teams that are hosting those opening weekend pods.
Yeah, we have 16 opening weekend pods in the Division III men's and women's basketball tournaments. And the committee has shown and said that as much as possible, they like to get these top 16 teams to be the hosts. Now, there are geographical considerations in here. You're not guaranteed by definition. The 16th and the 17th team might switch spots because of geographical needs. You might need another team in the Midwest or the upper Midwest or the Northeast or the Southeast, like wherever. You might need an extra host spot, so this can shift around. But you've put yourself in a good position to be considered if you are the top 16. So unsurprisingly, the 8 teams from the previous slide are also 8 of the most likely top 16 teams. But add to that Cortland, Catholic, UW Whitewater, St. Thomas, Texas, Wash U, Tufts, WPI, Gustavus Adolphus. These are right now the teams, the computer thinks by simulating the rest of the season, the likely outcomes or the possible outcomes, these teams most frequently received those top 16 spots. Now you can see like Tufts and WPI and Gustavus Adolphus, they were actually more likely not to be in than they were to be in. But of all the teams, they were the most frequent appearers in those top 16 spots still.
A little bit interesting taking these last 2 slides in, in concert with each other. You see Emory and Eau Claire swap spots.
Mm-hmm.
So, Eau Claire is more likely to get a top 8 than Emory, but then Emory more likely than Eau Claire to get a top 16. And we see Whitewater is another one of those teams that appears higher in the pecking order for the top 8 than they do the top 16, which probably tells me that the simulations, you know, there's those simulations where those 2 teams are winning a bunch of games in the WIAC, and that's going to really push them up into the top 8. But in the ones that they don't, that hurts them a lot more, where they're falling out of the top
Yeah,
16,
right.
right? Kind of that it's either going to be like above that top 8 line or below that 16 line. Not drastically,
Yeah.
maybe. Like we don't see big movements, but it's just kind of an interesting dynamic I noticed as we were flipping pages here.
Yeah. Yeah. So the simulations in which they were not quite as good or they didn't win quite as many games, then they tumbled a little bit further than maybe the others did. So yeah, that is an interesting dynamic as well. As you zoom out a little bit, the teams who are the most likely to be top 8 aren't always in the exact order as the top 16, and that it really does depend on your conference strength and your conference schedule strength and how many opportunities do you have. If you are one of those teams with fewer opportunities and you miss on one of those opportunities, then those simulations, you might just be out of the entire top 16. Whereas if you do take advantage of those, you might be more likely to even be in a top 8 situation. Yeah.
So that's where the simulations see the tournament field and some of the important seeding. Just to highlight again, Matt, this is really a snapshot in time. So this is a simulation of projection based on, the snapshot in time that we're taking it. Games are going to continue to be played, and the computer is going to look at future results, and it's going to, start turning those games that were open-ended before into 0% win probabilities and
Yeah.
100% win probabilities. And even if there's an expected result, maybe the computer expected a win by a bigger margin, and so the computer might knock a team a little bit for that, right? So there's always these adjustments, not only in terms of games that are that could be wins, could be losses, getting changed to definite wins and definite losses, but those computer ratings are always changing based on what, was it a 1 point win, was it a 21 point win, right? And based on that computer line that we pick in the weeks
Yeah.
the week's pick slate, um, those things are always shifting, right? So as a snapshot in time, a week from now, it's going to create a different snapshot in time. And so that goes back to what we talked about with those daily updates, right? So there's going to be shifts, and it's really about taking a look at the range of possibilities based on what the computer thinks of every team to date.
Yeah. And a couple other things I'll call out. We not really talking about it in this episode, but I think a cool thing that we show on the site, your at-large percentage chance if your last loss comes in a particular round of your conference tournament. So for each team, I show what's the times you made it to your finals and lost. What's your tournament odds there? If you lost in the semifinals, what's your tournament loss there? are your tournament odds there? If you lost in the quarterfinals, what's your tournament odds there? So just again, I'll pick out our team, Calvin, because we know them. Currently, right now, when they reach the finals and lose, 46% of the time they receive an at-large bid. So there's kind of 50-50 there. If they lose in the semifinals, only about 20% of the time did they get an at-large bid. So when we get later in the season, I think those numbers, that's one thing we kind of get messages from coaches or programs or fans from teams saying, like, if we get to the finals, will we get in? And obviously that changes a lot because of the whole landscape of the country around you. More and more upsets happen on conference tournament championship week than the fewer spots you have. But on average, right, what are the chances that you can reach that spot? That's a really key number to look at as well. You can find that on the site.
And maybe this is getting too far into the weeds now, but just as we watched this play out a year ago, sometimes you might be a team that has a number one or number two seed, and you're in a 16 conference tournament, and you see that upset in the first round. So you maybe get a little bit of an easier game. Well, from a tournament, an NPI standpoint, that may not be what you want,
Yeah.
right? Because that semifinal game, then if you lose, has a chance to hurt you even more than it would have had the other team won, and if you win, doesn't have the ability to help you as much, right? So that's something else to think about. It's not just strictly getting to that round, but there's also who are
Yep.
you actually playing in that round that's going to dictate
Yeah.
how beneficial it is to win or how detrimental it might be
Yeah,
to lose in that round.
exactly. Yeah. A lot of times it thinks that finals loss is to the number 2 seed, but if it's the number 5 seed, then that's a worse loss than the computer often thinks it
Right.
is. All right, Zach, so we've simulated a bunch. We've talked about who are the top 16, the top 8, who's the AQs, who are the possible at-large teams. Another fun thing that goes on with these that I like to put together are mock brackets. Now, our website doesn't automatically put this together every day, but I often will construct them and tweet them out. So I'm going to take you through a fast version of how that process plays out, how I do it, and how I think the committee will largely do it. So since we know the top 8 seeds are protected, I just start by putting the top 4 seeds right across 1, 2, 3, 4. And the way when I just do like in a line, I'm not bracketing these, but the way I do it is the outside teams would meet in the final 4, and then the inside 2 would meet. So that's how you'd bracket, kind of like upper left, upper right, bottom left. But anyway, so the top 4 seeds go right across 1 through 4. Now, this year's a little bit of a unique year with the D1, D2, D3 championship game weekend all happening together. Shifts our calendar a little bit. So instead of a Final 4 weekend, we're getting an Elite 8 weekend in Fort Wayne. So 8 teams. We're going to play the round of 8 and the round of 4 in Fort Wayne, which means all these teams are meeting at a neutral site. That just means there's no geography involved in trying to match up a number 2 seed with a number 1 seed. So quite often, maybe 2 Wisconsin schools or something would be put together, or you just work out the geography such that you'd maybe minimize flying teams around in the second weekend. We don't have to worry about that this year. So we can perfectly seed 1 through 4 and 5 through 8 so that the number 1 overall seed Trinity and the number 8 overall seed UW Eau Claire could meet in Fort Wayne on that first day. Makes things really kind of interesting this year. So that's the first thing you do. Easy. Any questions about that, Zach? I don't think so.
I don't, but we want to maybe we'll get into it in terms of how you go about bracketing versus maybe how we saw it happen last year in terms of just defining team buckets and groups of seating. But continue.
Yeah, we'll talk about that as we go. Yeah, that's a good point though. We will definitely put a pin in that. The next thing that I do is I like to fill out the rest of the top 16. So here we do have geography involved. So I try to put the 3 seeds on the 3 line if possible, and the 4 seeds on the 4 line if possible. But I will mix and match because we want to try to eliminate Division III. We have budgetary constraints, so the committees are tasked with kind of minimizing flights. So WPI and Trinity, Connecticut, those are 2 kind of proximate teams they can bus to each other. The next one I do have a flight, Gustavus and Randolph-Macon, so that doesn't really work. But like Whitewater and Eau Claire, I don't want to put 2 conference teams together if I could, but I think like Wash U can't bus to Eau Claire, and so I'd maybe switch Wash U and Whitewater and mix them up with opposite conference teams. But if I can't stay within 500 miles, That's the flight cutoff in Division III. Then I have to move it around, so I do. So I believe this is the way to mostly keep teams within 500 miles. But at this point in the bracket, when you've got the top 16 spots, there's several factors that you are unsure of. We don't know if the regionality works yet. So I might have too many teams in the Midwest or not enough teams in the Northeast, or do I have my like Region 10 island teams figured out? So at this point, I'll usually pause and I'll look at those island teams. So I'm looking here at one of my top 16 teams was St. Thomas, Texas. So that's okay. There's an island pod. Can I make the seating work out pretty well here? And actually, right now it does. It almost works out. It almost works out perfectly. In this pod here, you fly Redlands from Southern California. You have Trinity, Texas, bus to St. Thomas, and you have Mary Hardin Baylor bus to St. Thomas. You get a proper host. You only use one flight. That works out really good. The only problem here is Trinity, Texas is probably too strong of a team for kind of like a quote unquote number 11 seed. But the committee would absolutely bracket this together, and this would be a pod.
And it's four conferences now.
And it's four conferences because
as Trinity's in the SAA.
Yes. Right? Four conferences, two regions. So it's not all Region 10 teams, even though we're all in Texas. I know these Texas teams do typically play each other more often than we would like them to, but this is a legal bracket. And I think to me, it's better than having two teams from the same conference in the same bracket. So at least Trinity and St. Thomas won't have to go through each other this year to play conference tournament and then maybe still end up in the same first weekend pod. They are different conferences now. So my big island situation is settled by this one, kind of fortunately just by the seeding of the teams. Another big island situation to worry about is Emory. Atlanta, Georgia can be difficult. So what do you do there? So I would look at that next. Seeding wise, this also currently almost works perfectly. So like NC Wesleyan can bust to Emory. They're like a 15 seed. Roanoke, I think, was perfectly a 10 seed. They could be there. And then Claremont Mudd Scripps has to fly somewhere anyway, coming from Southern California. Assuming that one of those, that either Redlands or CMS isn't strong enough to host a pod there. And they kind of work out as to be like the 7 seed there. So I think my two big island situations are satisfied in this type of bracket. Now we just need to know general geography. Does it work? It's a little easier than island geography, but like at this point, I don't know. For instance, can I put a pod at Gustavus Adolphus? Can I get enough teams there? Or am I going to need to move a team out of maybe more of the Midwest region and move a team out east? Like, do I need another team in Massachusetts or something like that? Like, we'll have to find that out. So I will just now work through across the seed lines. I'll fill in the 5s and I'll fill in the 6s. And we have to be very geographically conscious here because we have to keep all of these essentially from here on out within 500 miles. The only island team not accounted for already in this view is Whitworth from the Northwest Conference. You can plug them in anyway. I think that's the only one missing. Otherwise, you try as much as possible to fit all the teams in the 500-mile rule. And I will just fill in the rest of the bracket here, and Zach will have that conversation about how I bracket teams versus how we've seen the committee in past years. And as it turns out, I was able to get all of these teams to be pods. It did work out with the Gustavus Adolphus in kind of the upper Midwest. The only one thing I will say is there were an awful lot of NESCAC teams in the simulation. So over on the far right, there's a pod that quote unquote should be at Catholic that I think we would have to host at St. Joseph, Connecticut to be able to get Bowdoin there. Bowdoin from Maine and Catholic cannot bus within 500 miles. The only way I could have it work out without too much extra effort of going through the whole process again was just to say that would be hosted at St. Joseph, Connecticut. So that is a thing that can happen, a third-party host, just to make the geography work. But that's what we're calling my mock bracket here. So Zach, you had a question about bracketing and seeding. Do you want to maybe ask that here and we can discuss that now?
Yeah, I think one of the big hopes as, really for the first time, we had distinct 1 through 64 seeding as NPI gave us. So I think the hope was that we would see as close to a true bracketed tournament as we could, again, within those geographic constraints that you so rightly pointed out. But it seemed like instead of constructing a bracket with teams grouped into like 16 buckets of four, right? You have your
Mm,
one seeds, your two seeds. We talk about that with a top eight, but extending that kind of philosophy all the way down to 13 seeds, 14 seeds. But it seems like instead, uh, the committee operated a little bit more under maybe how previous committees and tournament brackets were put together, where we were talking more about, is this a pod 1, is this a pod 2, a pod 3, or a pod 4, right? So it's that philosophy of creating a bracket based on seeding teams within 16 buckets of 4 teams each, right? Those 1 through 16 seeds versus 4 buckets of 16
yeah.
team, right, right. So there's a big difference between maybe a 16 seed and a 13 seed. But if you're taking the pod 1 through 4 approach, well, they're all pod number 4 seeds, and so they're all kind of interchangeable within the bracket.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good way to put it, Zach. This is our second season in NPI. Under the previous season, we never had a national ordered list that the committees could work off of. I think they knew a general list, but I don't know that they went through the process of trying to order teams that way. So yeah, they would put teams into those larger buckets. So what's now the top 16? They would have a top 16. They did reveal those before, ahead of the tournament, or who were the likely top 16 teams.
Well,
Um,
again, we've always had 16 first
yes, we
weekend
knew who the
hosts,
hosts
right?
were.
So that's sort of like nominally the top 16
Yes.
seed.
So we had like top overall seeds and we had top 16s, but they were in larger buckets. It was essentially each pod. We have 4 team pods. Are you a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4 in each pod? Whereas 1 would host, 4 would play the host, and 2 and 3 would play each other. And I think the committees have done a pretty good job within those constraints of putting brackets together. I think last year, now that we have in NPI just like printed off, games are done, print, here's all the orders, 1 through 64, here are the teams. I think our hope was that within the geographic constraints, we would see a little bit more of a truly seeded bracket. And I think the messaging we heard after the fact was still very much we got the 1s and the 4s and the 2s and the 3s kind of where they should go, and we were happy with that. And on some level, that's good because you're always working within the constraints. But there were a few, and we're nitpicking. We're obviously nitpicking here, but I think there were a few spots where we could have maybe moved things around to just fairly seed things a little bit more. We have never seen like a 1 through 16 quadrant in Division III basketball. They're not seeded that way. You can use NPI to say like who should be in what spot. But we would think we were hoping, and our hope is still that we will trend a little bit more toward a true seeding. Whereas there's a difference between who should be a 16 seed, like who should play Trinity, Connecticut, and who should play Catholic, right? If Catholic's a 4 seed, that team should be different. It's not just that you can put a 4 as a 4. The quality and level of those 4s matters, right? And I think we can move maybe more towards that. I will say, however, I don't even think the Division One bracket is a true 1 through 64 seeding, right? They move teams around. They have specific, I think, guidance where they're not allowed to match conferences up before. I don't know if it's the Sweet 16 or the Elite Eight. So in Division Three, they conferences cannot play in the first round, and they try as much as possible to avoid them being in the same first round pod. But other than that, there's no strict like guideline between separating conferences. So even in Division One, they do move teams behind the scenes in seed lines. That's my understanding anyway, and things like that. So
But again, when you're taking a 1 through 16 approach and you're moving a team 1 seed line, that's a lot different than when you're taking a group of 16
yeah,
teams that are basically the same
right,
seed and moving them around. Like that could be functionally a difference of like 3 seed lines,
yeah,
right? So
yeah,
that's where maybe taking a little bit of a more granular approach can give us kind of maybe the best of both worlds, where we're still maintaining a little bit of flexibility and um and being able to put together a bracket based on those geographic constraints, but we're
yeah,
still getting as close to a true seeded
yep,
tournament as possible. Now let's I mean, just even in terms of talking about flexibility, if we look at how a true seeded tournament last year should have come out, I think we would have expected Bethany Lutheran to play UW Platteville. However, they didn't. And part of that, I think a big part of that was taking the student athlete experience into account. I think correctly in this case because Bethany Lutheran in the previous tournament had played Wisconsin Platteville, right? So while the true seeding maybe should have allowed for that game to happen, maintaining a little bit of
Yeah.
flexibility says, "Hey, Bethany Lutheran, we're going to give you a little bit of a different experience. Instead of having to go play Platteville again, we're going to put you somewhere else." And I think Grinnell ended up having to play
Yeah.
Platteville instead, right? So there is opportunity, I think, to correctly use some flexibility. Let's just maybe think about it a little bit more granularly in terms of 1 through 16 seeding so that when we're doing that kind of thing, we're not making big adjustments that suddenly could have the
Yeah.
unintended consequence of throwing off kind of being
Yeah.
directionally appropriate in terms of the seeding.
And I'm always more happy to hear an explanation like that. Like it could be we moved these teams further on the seed line than we would have otherwise liked to because it was a repeat matchup from last year. Or these two teams have already played this season and we wanted to avoid that as much as possible. If you have to move teams a few seed lines for that, I think that's okay. When I do my mock brackets, I can keep almost all teams within one seed line. If I'm moving more than two seed lines, then I feel real bad about it. So I know we have geographic constraints. I think you can still do a really good job of seeding within that most of the time. You get some crazy wonky brackets sometimes where there's really not a lot of way around that. Most of the time, you can keep that in pretty well. And then maintaining flexibility around that, I think, is good. If you want to move teams further for some of those repeat matchup type things, I think that can be good. Also, though, you have to keep in mind that that's not just those two teams you're affecting. You're also affecting Grinnell in that situation and maybe giving them a different, maybe worse experience than they otherwise would have. But those are trade-offs you have to make. So definitely understand all these things. And I will also say, when I do my mock brackets, I don't, especially this early in the season, I don't spend a lot of time looking at this was a repeat matchup from last year, or I know these two teams have played this year, because I'm just kind of slotting teams in kind of the right position and saying, does a bracket work or not? And kind of where would your team be seated and what types of teams would they be playing? But that is, I think, an exercise I do take more seriously when we get more toward February, when the brackets start becoming more real. And the committees do take that into consideration. So when you're talking about geography, talking about not trying to repeat matchups, talking about not trying to repeat matchups from this previous season or the tournament before, and keeping teams seated, and it becomes a lot. And I think within that, the committees do generally do a pretty good job.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we're talking nitpicks here,
Yeah.
right? It's not committees doing bad jobs. There's constraints and sometimes competing interests at play here when you're talking about seeding and geography and student athlete experience based on matchups from previous tournaments and conferences not meeting in the first round, right? So there's a lot of things at play. And we have gotten great brackets, and I have no doubt we will continue to do so. Right? It's just always in search of that perfect bracket.
Yeah. Yep.
All right, so as you mentioned, that's a lot. But it's really just a snapshot in time. Going to be fun to start tracking this. I know we've mentioned it in previous episodes. It's been live at d3datacast.com for a while, but this good time of year as we turn the page from 2025 to 2026. We start getting into the nitty gritty of conference season. Start looking ahead at those scenarios in terms of who's going to be moving on beyond the regular season. Start talking about it, and even as it pertains to a mock bracket, yeah, it's going to change. This is not going to be the 64 team field we see. The seeding is going to be a lot different.
Yeah.
But
Right.
kind of going through the process, Matt, I know you and Ryan Scott and others who
Mm-hmm.
actually do go through this, right? It allows you to start to see some of the problems that the committee might face, whether it has to do with geography or certain matchups, and just especially now that there's a little bit of rigidity at play in terms of those top 8 seeds and where they are. Right, so there's going to be some things that maybe are hot reactions when a bracket gets dropped, but for people like you and others who are looking at this, they're going to be things that you saw coming.
Yeah. Yeah. When we get into January and February, I probably make a bracket every single day. So I have done a lot of work in putting brackets together, and I take mileage into account. Although the NCAA hid the official mileage tool from us, so I have to use Google Maps and call that close enough for now. But I mean, I do the work, so I'm hopefully gonna offer constructive criticism, and I know people aren't doing a bad job, but um, you know, I've spent time putting in brackets together, so if I comment, then I hope it's a valid one.
I hope it is too. All right, we're going to take our week 8 and 9 picks in review together next week, but we do have another pick slate for week 9. Let's start talking about that, Matt.
Yeah, so looking ahead here to some games starting on December 30 through January. Well, I guess there's no games at 29. So yeah, 30 through January 3 here. Here's the slate for week 9. Babson, 6-point underdogs by our computer at Johns Hopkins. Zach, who do you like in that game?
I always struggle with Babson games, right? They knock off Trinity, Connecticut last year. This year they lose to them by 33. I feel like they always do the opposite of what I'm going to pick. So congratulations, Beavers, because I'm going Johns Hopkins, which probably guarantees a Babson win here.
Yeah, Zach, I knew you were going to pick wrong on Babson, so I went the opposite way of you, and I'm going to go with Babson plus the 6. I think they can keep it close here. Johns Hopkins, I think as a team, I've rated a little higher, but 6 points, I think they can keep that within that margin. Next game, our computer sees NYU as a 5-point underdog on the road at St. Joseph, Connecticut. How do you pick that game?
Yeah, a little surprised to see the line here. I think St. Joseph, Connecticut is one of those teams the computer likes, certainly more than, maybe you would think off the top of your head. Maybe the computer's right, but I like trying to pick against the teams that I perceive to be computer darlings. Maybe it's to my detriment, but give me NYU plus the 5.
All right, Zach, you were going to take NYU, and so will I, probably for similar reasons. I think that the lines is pretty big. Two teams that I see as approximately equal in talent. So I think NYU can keep that one close, if not win it outright. Our next one is a new NCAC conference game, Zach. January 3 is going to be conference play for NCAC. John Carroll, 3-point underdogs at DePaul. I mentioned this conference as one that's being too close to call from a automatic qualifier situation. And I think these are two teams that could be in the mix there.
Yeah, they are, and I'm sure that there's a lot of games that if you looked at a computer line for, games between that whatever 5 or 6 team mix in the NCAC, it's gonna be the home team favored by 3, which is essentially
Yeah, more or less.
just
Yeah.
the computer giving the home court advantage to the home team. I think I'm starting to become a DePaul believer, so, given
Okay.
3 at home, give me the Tigers.
All right, Zach, you're right. This is essentially a home court advantage play. I think John Carroll's good. I think they're definitely in the mix. This is going to be a great game to watch, but I'm going to take the Blue Streaks plus the 3, hoping that they can keep it within the basket there. So I'll go JCU plus the 3 points. So far, I've gone all road teams, so maybe I'm a little nervous about that. We'll see how that goes. Next one out in the WIAC, another conference game, Eau Claire at Stevens Point. This is a half-point margin, so essentially just a pick 'em in favor of Stevens Point. So since this is a pick 'em, Zach, who are you picking?
I'm gonna go with Stevens Point here, and, like you said, it is a pick 'em defaulting to the home team in conference play. Matt, we talked about our, we did our at-large fantasy draft contest, right? And Eau Claire was one of my picks, but I kept thinking coming out of that, I don't know if you had any, reactions or I don't know if you'd say regrets, but I was just wondering if there's a team out there that probably didn't get the consideration from either of us that it deserved, it might be Stevens Point
Yeah.
here. So give me the dogs at home.
I can definitely see Stevens Point being a team in a couple of weeks that we're talking about as kind of how have they not been firmly on the national radar all season long. I think that world definitely exists. I'm going to go with the Pointers too. I see this as an even game. It's a pick 'em, so I'm going with the home team. I know our computer really likes Eau Claire. I feel like this will be maybe their biggest test of the season. So in that case, since they are of the two teams, I think maybe the lesser tested right now, I'm going to go with Stevens Point just to win this one at home. And I think in the WIAC, it's going to be all about protecting home court. Okay, Zach, so one we've called the D3 Datacast Game of the Week down in Virginia. It's a good one. Virginia Wesleyan and Mary Washington, although this line surprised me. Our computer sees this as a 9.5-point line. Mary Washington are big favorites at home.
Yeah, I think I'm mostly reacting to the 9.5 point line there. Give me Virginia Wesleyan plus the points.
Yeah, I'm going to say the same thing. I expect Mary Washington that they can win this game. I think they could win this kind of convincingly, but still maybe single digits, right? This could be a 7, 8, 9-point game, and Virginia Wesleyan still covers that one. So I'm going to go with the Marlins as well, mostly just because it's a big line. It's basically a 10-point line. That feels too big. Maybe Mary Washington can do it, but I think that's how it's going to do for me. So we had 3 games the same. Babson and John Carroll are going to decide it, hopefully for me. Johns Hopkins, DePaul for you. And as you said, we're going to recap both weeks next time with the kind of Christmas and New Year's holiday. We had to get this episode in a little bit early before all the games were in from last week. So we'll review them all next time. But as always, make your picks below and we'll see how we do together, Zach. I think we have a mailbag.
Yeah, we do have one for the mailbag here. It came in as a comment on last week's episode. This from Don't Let the Old Man In at KW0113 on YouTube. I'm surprised based on previous episode ranking conferences that no at-large predictions for CCIW ranked fourth. Even if they beat each other up in conference play, wouldn't they statistically have a high likelihood of getting one at-large bid? Touched on this, I think, a little bit in the episode. The main topic here we did, but maybe just to be a little bit more direct to this question, put a little finer point on it, Matt. What do you think?
Yeah, our simulations have tended to give them about 1.2 or 1.3 bids. So on average, only zero point 0.2 or 0.3 of an at-large bid. That means most of the time they are not getting one. It's a strong conference. They were ranked fourth, as the commenter says. That's really good. But I think right now, as you mentioned, Zach, we're maybe not seeing as many teams with the 8-1, 9-0 type records right now. Augustana had a really good week. We called it out last week. They had 2 top 10 wins. They're still 6-4 though. So the way NPI works, you can overcome losses with good wins and a good strength of schedule. But the way I think our computer sees that conference happening or playing out is we're not going to have a team that goes through and only has 1 or 2 losses. Probably, like, teams are going to take multiple losses. So when you stack that up with a non-conference slate that hasn't seen very many teams, get through unscathed, they've played good teams. They've played good teams close. They haven't always won those games. They've won a number of them, right? It's a good conference with good teams. So right now it's just shaping up to be maybe a perfect storm to conspire against the CCIW and not really get those really good NPI numbers. We could, based on how the final few games of non-conference play go, and then depending how the league shapes up, if, say, Illinois Wesleyan and Augustana, or maybe an Elmhurst or someone like that, really start ripping through the league and beating up on other teams, we could see 1 or 2 or 3 rise above and be in that at-large position. Also depends on the conference tournament, right? Is one of those teams in play for at-large and they don't win the tournament? That's a way that some of these kind of 1-ish to 2 bid leagues really solidify. That second one is the favorite doesn't win. So it really will depend on what's the shape of that league in conference play. Is a team like Carthage and North Park and North Central, are they beating up on those other teams that are at maybe higher ranked in NPI right now? Or are some of those top teams really able to go through with kind of more sterling records? We'll have to see on that front.
Yeah, and I think we mentioned in the previous episode that this is one we could see definitely trending more towards the 2. You talked about looking at the Pool C odds. There's a group of NESCAC teams that probably it's not going to be all 3 of those teams, and as it plays out, as some of those 50-50 games become 100-0 games, someone's going to steal those odds and someone's going to fall out. I think the computer's seeing a lot of these CCIW games that are just kind of 50-50 games, and then when you put it all in aggregate, there's just so much uncertainty that it's probably costing the league a little bit more in terms of tournament expectation. And so where that scenario maybe leads to a NESCAC school falling out, I think that kind of scenario leads to a
Yeah,
CCIW
good.
coming in, right? It's gonna be big. If a lot of these games are kind of 50-50, if if there's a team or 2 who can start maybe turning some expected, 1-1s in the double round robin into 2-0s while avoiding going 0-2 in some of the other ones, I think that's where we're gonna see those scenarios where someone else, can get themselves into the mix. I think the opportunity is there. There's just so much uncertainty as to who it might be, can they actually do it, that the computer isn't really seeing it as necessarily likely right now. But go again back to the mailbag question we had a week ago from Jacob Schauer about a CCIW team that has 19 or 20 wins overall. And when you start looking at those scenarios, yeah, it's very likely that that team would be a serious contender for an at-large bid, right? So it's just a matter of, are there going to be a team or teams who's actually able to get there? Because if they are, then they become probably a favorite to be able to
Yeah.
get into that tournament field.
And just I'll call out Augustana since we already talked about them the last 2 weeks. Sitting at 6-4, but with some good wins, are they a team that can go through the rest of the CCIW play like 9-5, or are they going to be 11-3? Right, that's a big difference for their pool C odds. At 9-5 with an additional loss in a conference tournament, I don't know if that's a record that they can then overcome if their NPI will
Right.
be high enough with that many losses. But if they're
But
if
if they have 7 total losses, right? So that's only what, 3 more than what they have right now. They're winning
yeah,
most of their games and
yep,
getting some fairly decent wins on the resume. Like at that point, I think we've seen like in the NJAC scenario last year where, 7, 8 losses was okay because there's enough
yeah,
quality wins built into it to overcome it,
right,
right? So I think that that's kind of what you're looking for. If you're going to be taking a total of 8, 9 losses, yeah, that's probably going to be disqualifying. But if you're going to be maybe even up to, 7 in a CCIW, I think along the way in yeah, racking up a few more losses, but you're also picking up the kind of wins that are really going to help you. I think that
right,
maybe that's an overall resume that can overcome that number of losses.
right. Like compare UW La Crosse and Stevens Point with Augustana and Illinois Wesleyan. Illinois Wesleyan and Augustana have taken a couple of more losses than those other teams have. So that's why maybe the WIAC, it feels like there's 4 or 5 WIAC teams that are all like 9-0 or 8-1 or whatever, kind of exiting or coming into the end of non-conference play. Whereas it feels like those types of CCIW teams are more like 3-4 losses right now. So that I think that's the big difference. I think that's why you're seeing the difference in the odds.
All right, we can do a mailbag at the end of every episode. Lots of ways to get in touch with us. If you have something for us to address at the end of a future episode, leave a comment on this video on YouTube. You can find us at D3 Datacast on all of that social media garbage, and we'd love to talk about whatever you have that you'd like to hear us talk about. It wraps up the mailbag, which leaves just one more thing to do before we get out of here for good. And that is to say good job, team, to our group of supporters at patreon.com/D3Datacast, including a new great job team supporter this past week, Graham Dunwoody. Thanks for joining the team here. Matt, this page once again is getting filled up. I keep smushing things and unfortunately have to make names smaller.
Mm-hmm.
We got one line there. Are you next?
Yeah, keep making Zach have to do more work and adjusting this page to get everything to fit. Or maybe we're going to have like a second page full of people. That would be awesome to see too. Patreon.com/D3Datacast. We offer a $3 a month and a $5 a month tier. We'd be so glad to have you join us. It helps us create these episodes, helps us to cover Division III basketball, put the simulations and all the good juicy data on D3Datacast.com, and keep that website ad-free as it is now. So thank you everyone who has joined with us. And we would love if you considered joining us as well, Zach. But for now, I think we had a great time talking about computer rankings, simulations, all of the above. Let's go enjoy some more games and let's say, good job, team.